being there for our patients with HIV. As a healthcare worker, you could be a hope builder. When someone learns that they have HIV, it is often one of the worst days of their life. Suddenly, no matter how young they are, it will be a pill that will keep them alive. They fear lovers and families may leave them or lash out at them at the point they let them know. They may be overwhelmed by the financial aspects of the disease, especially if they're underinsured or not insured at all. Having this disease leaves them wondering if they may be seen through the stigma of the disease rather than for the unique and wonderful person they are. Healthcare workers who are afraid to treat them or are overusing personal protective equipment may give them the feeling that they are dirty or unclean. So how can you help being a healthcare worker? First, you can make a difference. Make sure the individual leaves the office with knowledge of support groups and counselors. And take time to check in with the patient and see how they're doing emotionally each visit. And use the PPE that's appropriate. Too much makes the patient feel you're afraid of them. And offer them information for financial assistance, for insurance, or for medication coverage. Can I get through this? I'm going to tell you about a story that a student gave me. She was in my HIV class, and she wrote this in a discussion board. And I felt it was so profound that I asked her if I could share the story with others. And she said, as long as I didn't share her name. So relax and listen to this story I'm going to tell you. It really did happen to someone. I worked for a nursing facility and had been a CNA there for almost 2 years when the incident began. I came into work and was in the break room putting my belongings in my locker when a couple of ladies from the day shift came in, all in an uproar. They began telling me that I had a new patient on my hall and that he was only 35 years old. I heard from these ladies that he had AIDS virus and that we weren't going to touch him, and they insisted that I do the same or I would get it too. This was the early 90s, and this was going to be my first experience with someone who had AIDS. I have to admit, now, almost 20 years later, that at the moment I was scared, and I wondered how I was going to get out of this. The patient was a 35-year-old white male with hepatitis C and AIDS. He had fallen asleep while driving, not under the influence, but because of a progression of disease, and had crossed over the center lane of a roadway and hit an 80-year-old woman driving an older Cadillac. The woman was uninjured, but the 35-year-old male was sentenced to aggravated vehicular assault, and he was going to spend some time in prison. Before being sent to prison, this patient was shackled to a bed in the infirmary in the county jail. He was forced to use a urinal and bedpan to do his bodily functions, as they didn't want him contaminating the facilities. He was not allowed his 1 hour of day recreation time, and he spent more than 5 months in this condition. Having spent this time shackled to his bed, he was almost completely unable to walk. Eventually, a catheter was inserted, and this guy was sentenced to die a horrible death. He was given the same sack lunch for each meal: dry bologna sandwich, overripe banana or apple, and warm 2% milk carton. He received this lunch 3 times a day for 5 months. Upon much debate, apparently the authorities came up with the decision to withhold sentencing, and they sent him to a nursing home to live out his remaining days. So I walked into the patient's room, and I find an extremely shy and broken man. Sitting in his wheelchair, looking at an old photo album of him and his past experiences. Photos of beautiful places he had been, giant fish that he had caught, and members of his family that had loved him deep, despite his condition. I immediately forgot everything I was thinking when I prepared to enter the room. I went right back into caregiver mode. Day shift hadn't bothered to unpack his belongings. They left him sitting in the middle of the room, with his coat on, no TV on, nothing to drink at his table, and a full catheter bag. So I introduced myself, asked him if I could get something before I emptied his cath. He cowered his head, a tear streamed down his face. "You'll need to get on your radiation suit." I have AIDS. What he's referring to was the double gown, double, triple gloves, and face shield he had gotten used to. I thought about this for a minute and thought about a horrific thing to add to his demise than to be treated as if he was the disease, instead of someone who had a disease and needed to be cared for. Everyone who had any contact with him for the past 5 months dressed this way when they had any contact with him, even the men who brought him in his lunch. He had gotten so used to this and so used to no one caring about him that pretty much he no longer cared for himself. I didn't double up gown. I didn't double my gloves. I hung a towel on the chair, shielded me from his cath bag, and carefully did my job. I spent as much time as I could with him unpacking his things, setting up his room as he saw fit. He didn't talk much the rest of the night until I got ready to leave, and he asked if he could give me a hug. I think he needed the hug more than he really wanted to give me one. He said, "Thank you for treating me like a human and not a rabid animal." I walked down the hall, head down, tears rolling down my cheeks. To this day, I don't know if I felt more sorry for him or if I was ashamed of myself for feelings that I had had earlier in the day. A good mixture of both, I suppose. Within weeks, this patient was up and walking, and I made sure he did his exercises, whether he was really up to it or not. There was a reason for his condition other than neglect, or there was no reason for his condition other than neglect. And when physical therapy determined he could get back on his feet, I did my part to make sure he did. He began going out on day trips with friends and family and was no longer using a catheter bag. He was even going fishing with his best friend on a river nearby. He was living again. During this time, several nursing assistants and one nurse spent a good amount of their time neglecting this patient, and nothing was ever done, despite the complaints of myself and other staff members. This was the last nursing home I ever worked in. After the patient passed away, I went on vacation and put in my 2 weeks' notice, never going back. I eventually went back to work and did so in an AIDS respite center, a long-term care facility caring for people from all walks of life with this heartbreaking disease. And here I am 20 years later. The shoulda, the woulda, the coulda that come to mind. I should have advocated for him, but back then I worked for the facility and not so much for the patient, or so I was taught. I would have advocated for him had I known what I know now. I could have called Adult Protective Services to reach outside of the family for help with this issue. But back then, we weren't given the tools or the information to do something about this kind of issue. I'm so glad we are different now. We are called to a higher authority if the place you are working in won't do anything to change this type of occurrence. After all was said and done, I know that because of this, I became a more caring, compassionate person who became passionate about caring for people. I learned that I needed to work on a one-on-one basis to be able to provide the best care possible for the people who desperately depend on me to provide it. I now make a difference in the lives of my patients.